What I've learnt about myself. I've gone through a rather unusually long and detailed self-scrutiny. This is manifested in various ways, particularly in the 10 volumes of autobiographical writing in which I've tried to document my life from birth through to the age of 30 and a few bits beyond, through not just memory, and not memory mainly at all, but through looking at the contemporary documents as a historian would do. So looking at letters, diaries, photographs, other personal things. And this has led to an enormously long self-scrutiny where I can look at myself at any age, almost day by day, but certainly month by month, the age of 10, 11, 12, and see what I was thinking and what other people were thinking of me. And that has enabled me to understand myself much better. I've done this principally since I retired 12 years ago. And through that and through lots of semi-autobiographical bits and pieces through my life, when I often introduced books by explaining how I came to write them, I've come to understand myself quite well. And others have commented that I do seem to know myself. This is prompted by advice from Alexander Pope, Know Then Thyself, etc., and from John Stuart Mill's advice that the two ways in which we understand how the world works is through self-knowledge of how a human being's one human being, which we know better than any other, namely ourself, works, and through history. So, although I'm not a psychoanalyst or psychologist, I do think I have come to terms to a considerable extent with myself, and I've learnt a number of lessons. One of them is rather nicely summarized in a quotation from Einstein. I know quite certainly that I myself have no special talents. Curiosity, obsession, and dogged endurance, combined with self-criticism, have brought me to my ideas. And that humble remark by Einstein, I'm not obviously putting myself on the par with him, but that summarizes me and my view too. I've always known, ever since I was 6 or 7, and my reports said, you know, Alan is well-meaning and he's hard-working and he's quite intelligent, and it was that and the combination of the much more glowing reports on my younger sister and my mother's occasional despairing of my reading ability that early instilled in me the idea that I was not naturally gifted. And that continued particularly in my preparatory school. I went up the middle classes. I was never in the top class or top part of classes, and I ended up in the third from the top class 2B. And my reports were, he tries hard, he's intelligent enough, and I wasn't even entered for a scholarship to my public school. And when I left my public school for university, I wasn't entered except for some marginal scholarship. And when I left Oxford, or finished my undergraduate degree rather, I got a 2-1, though on the borderline. And that borderline sums it up. I was nearly really good, but mostly well-meaning, hard-working, well-organized. But it was that realization which pushed me on to be all those things that Einstein talked about: dogged, curious, and persistent. and that is my character. I was the same with sports. I wasn't particularly good at them, not naturally gifted, quite small, quite slow, and yet by pushing myself on, I achieved some successes. And so I realized that self-organization, hard work, thinking about the problems, and curiosity were more important. So what is now known as social intelligence, being able to work with people, learning from experiences, all those things are as important as any kind of natural brilliance in, say, mathematics. All that is good enough for many things, not for one or two like mathematics or music, where you really need some other gifts. But I had enough to keep me going. And that is one of the things I learnt about myself. Another was that I am easily hurt. I suppose all of us are easily hurt. I may not show it, but when I get rebuffed, contradicted, told off, as my mother described me as a little boy, I go into internal, at least, sulks and get internally frustrated and angry, and I have to control this, and it's obviously particularly important in a marriage. And so I have a childish reaction, which I suppose most people do, but I know it in myself. Another was what you might call a short attention span. That is that as a child I used to love playing with my soldiers or animals or other games as children do, but I would not play with them for very long, and what I really hated was having to clear up after my playing. I would get them all out and have a game or two and then want to get on to something else. And so in some ways this has been a defect perhaps, but it's also an advantage, as the famous astronomer Martin Rees put it. One of his advantages was a short attention span, because it meant that he didn't linger too long on any problem, got it mostly right. As Einstein again said, it's better to get things roughly right than precisely wrong. So I would hurry on to something else and try to get things done quickly and go on to the next exciting adventure. And that can be an advantage as well as a disadvantage. Another thing I learnt about myself is that I'm basically optimistic. I tend to see the glass half full, and I can see this particularly in relation to my wife Sarah, who tends to see the glass half empty. So we look at the same facts, and she sees that this is a problem or a disaster or whatever, and I try and often succeed in persuading myself that there is a silver lining. And so I like quotations like Chinese quotation that every disaster is an opportunity. And that optimism is obviously maybe misleading, but it's also a great advantage, because depression, despair, a feeling you can't succeed or whatever is a cause of inaction. You sink into it further and further, and things get out of hand. So I've always been optimistic and trusting. That is another feature I can see, that I was trusting of other people, trusting of situations, trusting of the world. And I suppose I was encouraged in that by living in a pretty rational, pretty warm and supportive family, and then going to very good schools where I wasn't bullied, and on the whole my experiences were positive. And so by the end of university I was a hopeful person and a trusting person, and also obviously a very hard-working person from my middle teens onwards, I really applied myself to everything that I could do. So those are some of the features that I've learnt about. I've learnt that I'm always seeking, searching, trying to find out new things, a kind of directed curiosity about myself and about the world, which many people share, no doubt, but it's crushed early in life, and in my case I've managed to keep it going. So there are many other things, of course, I could go into, but I have learned a huge amount about how human beings work through a process of participant observation. And this is the last characteristic perhaps to mention. As an anthropologist, you participate in activities and events and other things, but you also observe yourself and others doing that. You stand above yourself, outside yourself. And in a way, this is what I've been doing through my life. And I was interested to hear one of my second cousins who was at school with me, my preparatory school. He said, Alan, when you were 12 or 13, you were one of the boys who was on the edge. You seemed to be slightly detached. You seemed to be part of the gang, but not in the middle of it. You were watching and observing and keeping your own counsel. And that characteristic, which is obviously useful for an anthropologist, is something which I think I've continued with since. Often when I go to events, parties, sherry parties or other kinds of parties, I'm quite happy not to be chattering away, but just to be watching people and overhearing conversations. It's combined with a certain shyness, I suppose. My grandfather noticed that I was quite a shy little boy and encouraged me to walk into a room with a smile and shake hands with and introduce myself, force myself to overcome my shyness. And I think he knew about this because he was also quite a shy man. And so shyness, slight withdrawnness, and distance are other characteristics of my character. I could go on forever, but this is somewhat self-indulgent, and it's probably best to leave others to decide who I am. So those are just a few things of what I've learned about myself.